Welcome to the Enterprise Excellence Podcast, where our purpose is to help create a better future. Learn from our world's experts how to improve your organization sustainably. Learn how to achieve and sustain an excellence journey for yourself, others, and the planet.
And I'm your host, Brad Jevons, coming to you from Brisbane, Australia. We are proudly brought to you in association with SA Partners, a world-leading business transformation consultancy. SA Partners are a truly purposeful company focused on helping organisations achieve sustainable improvement for themselves, others, and the planet.
Welcome to episode 48, What the All Blacks Can Teach Us About the Business of Life. We are really pleased to have James Kerr back on the show with us today. Last week we explored the principles of what makes a team great. We explored the shift the All Blacks made in their leadership approach, pass the ball as they called it, to shift ownership to the team. We explored the teamwork journey the All Blacks went on, their focus on playing with purpose and creating a learning environment. It is such a privilege to be able to explore this journey further with James Kerr today, author of the book, Legacy. Let's get into the episode.
What I find funny, James, and let's talk from Anzac. Okay, so you and I know Anzac, one of the most famous histories in military for a very small force. They did amazing things.
Yep.
And it's about mateship, club, massive ownership. The amount they fought and what they went through to do what they did was insane.
Yep.
And this is from two countries that, I don't know what you find, but how even in our countries our home countries of New Zealand and Australia, can we have that in our culture, and we have that background of that mateship and the front line and that. But it does seem like a lot of organizations, we still have more of an autocratic, dominant type of culture from the top, rather than remembering our roots and remembering. What's your thoughts on that? Why does that happen?
I think the larger an organization becomes and the longer it goes on for, the more kind of momentum is systemized. It's kind of, there's a calcification that goes on. A lot of the time those organizations were dynamic, meritocratic, egalitarian, mateship kind of things to begin with, but they get old and pale and stale, right? And it's easy, it's a cop-out, it's easy to go, right, well, we'll just tell people what to do and they'll do it, and that can work, and it can work for a short while. It tends not to become an environment in which people thrive, and you have to pay people more to stay, and the cracks start to appear, and a lot of the time the leadership knows it, but they're just there for a short time and a good time and a well-paid time. So the incentives necessary to reboot those cultures aren't necessarily strong. That being said, I think there is, there's something in the air at the moment that I think has changed things, particularly around that kind of climate, particularly with different generations coming in with different expectations, some for better, some for worse. I think for a sense that actually, I think the dawning realization is that actually, if you get your culture right, if you get the conditions in which people operate right, it is that force multiplier. You can do better. If people are just going through the motions about something they don't really care about, and they're just clocking in and clocking out, and the front line knows the decisions are not very good, but they don't care enough to pay it to fight back. We see it in, I don't know, name an organization, you can probably name that level of dysfunction. One of the issues about it is there is a talent war. You need to create an environment that people want to be part of, and it's something that's crackling with promise and purpose, that people talk about with pride at the pub. All of those things. If it for the leaders out there, are people boasting about working for you or not? Or are they kind of going, I know I work at one of the interesting conversations is, when somebody says, hey, how's the job? When do you bluff? When you want to put a good face, it's brilliant, and underneath you're going, except for X and Y and da-da-da. It's those conversations that are really important to have. I think, or to be able to have, and to be able to. Gilbert Enoka in the All Blacks has a great line. It just says, "Don't complain sideways, complain upwards."
Yeah.
You know, have you got a culture in which complaints really go upwards, or does everyone just kind of smoke cigarettes in the bike shed and kind of complain about the teachers? You know?
Yeah.
So I think there's been a moving away from that. I think there's something really interesting, and I don't want to kind of compare New Zealand and Australia too much, but I think there's been something really interesting in Australia around the move away a little bit from mateship to a more individualistic culture. I would say has happened.
Yeah.
A little bit, a culture a little bit more maybe aspiring to or modeled on the US rather than the sort of European model, if you like. We're all in this, the Commonwealth model, we're all in this together. Just to be provocative, I'd say it hasn't, in sport, it hasn't necessarily worked out that well for Australian sport in the last decade or two. You know, Australia used to be the world champion at being world champion.
Yeah.
You know, whether it was the Wallabies were on fire. I don't think the Kangaroos had ever been beaten.
No.
In the pool, it was extraordinary. Tennis was going berserk. Cricket was going through its finest days.
Yeah.
Or one of its kind of periods. Olympic medals were just there for the taking. America's Cup. You know, there was this huge sort of period in the sort of, I guess, from the sort of 70s into the 80s and into the beginning of the 90s, I guess, where Australian sport, that mateship, the cohesion that came from that, and the real level of passion and commitment and discretionary effort was massive, I think, for Australian sport. And I think that's fractured a little bit. And you go, where are the Wallabies now? No offense. I mean, and part of it's not just this. You know, there haven't been a lot of medals in the pool. Olympic results have gone down. Cricket, and there's been ball tampering, and it's been patchy. I think the Kiwis beat the Kangaroos.
Yeah,
what's gone on, Australia?
I know.
And you go, well, what is that? There's a reflection of a few things. A little bit less funding going into the Institute of Sport, inevitable ebbs and wanes, but there must be a cultural element to that. And I wonder, and have wondered for a long time, whether that's been the diminishment of the true mateship culture that is one of the things that defined Australia. And I think possibly does less.
And it's so powerful, like that mateship culture that made a small country like we are, what we became, is insane. But I've got to admit, James, and I'll probably be crucified by some people on this, but I've seen in the last... I've seen
you bring a Kiwi onto you.
I know, but I was about to pose back that what I've seen happen in New Zealand in the last 20 years has been the reverse. I look at New Zealand business, I look at New Zealand sport, and a lot of the cultural aspects. 20 years ago, there was people from New Zealand flocking to Australia like crazy, and something has turned the other way for New Zealand. And there's a study.
And I think it's been, I mean, we're talking big generalizations here, obviously, but I think there's been something in New Zealand around an embracing of their intrinsic DNA, fundamental values. And if you look at the evolution of the haka, for instance, within the All Blacks, it went from a kind of piece of cultural appropriation into a cultural expression, a real ownership of it. The embracing of Te Reo Māori as a second language, genuinely, the embracing of the sort of indigenous past, the reconciliation to a degree with the patchy parts of that history, a genuine sense of kind of pride, of belonging, and of being, and of I'm not going to say our, because I've been over that time. I haven't been living in New Zealand, though I've been there a lot. Is extraordinarily powerful, and you see that it's a similar process I've talked about. If you look at the teams that play above themselves, whether that's the All Blacks, the All Blacks, it's a country of 5 million people, and rugby is part of the, it's in the bloodstream of the nation. But the values that are brought about, and the coming together around common values, I think has been extraordinary.
Yeah, you just got to look at it in the business results, and also look and the sporting results. Like, is there a prominent sport that New Zealand plays that they don't hold the World Cup for at the moment?
Yeah, well, Well,
I don't know. Even sailing, you know,
one day cricket, I think, came pretty close, but yeah, no, and because that stuff works. You know, we are in interconnected species. You know, we aren't individuals. You know, no man is an island, etc. And you know, we can talk for a long time about the politics of that. You know, the sovereign individual versus the kind of the indentured servitude of the collective. But I think there's always that balance. Netflix and their culture deck talks about freedom and responsibility, and it's always that balance between the freedom to the autonomy to individuate, to become everything that we want to be our own person, balanced with our responsibility to collective action.
Yeah.
And actually that's the political spectrum, isn't it? If you pull it apart, you know, on one level it's, you know, Republican independence, liberty. On the other thing, there's some sort of pseudo-socialist kind of, you know, collectivism. But actually it's a, you know, an ideal culture really, where certainly within a team, is that balance. It's what is the relationship of the individual to the whole.
Yeah, the center.
You know, you don't ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Is absolutely central, I think, to that relationship between, you know, personal meaning and kind of public purpose, if you like, or collective purpose. And I think individuals and leaders and organizations that get that balance right really thrive, because that's the balance that we as humans need. We are part of something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah.
Spiritually, we feel that need. You know, socially, we feel that need. Emotionally, we feel that need. But we also need to feel that we are masters of our own destiny, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that we're living our life on our own terms. And looking at it through that way, from a leadership point of view, how can you create that healthy dynamic between those two opposites? I think becomes a really big question.
Yeah, leaders create leaders. And the other thing, I think a lot of what you've been talking about, James, and I've been listening to, and I see this in New Zealand culture at the moment, is that first lesson you put in there, which is, and correct me if I'm not right here, sweep the sheds.
That's, yeah.
Like that humility for a leader to get down and sweep the shed after the rugby game's finished, rather than leave it for the cleaner. That's pretty powerful when it comes to that type of approach.
Well, I think so. You know, something obviously, you know, was a killer story for this team. It was my lead story going into the book, and I think I chose that as sort of the lead story. I think because it illustrates something beyond the All Blacks. It illustrates that idea of kind of arrogant individualism. You know, if we talk arrogant individualism, it's the enemy of high performance. It's entitlement, you know. And I think one thing the All Blacks did very well, but any culture, you know, it's not a coincidence that the British SAS, in their ethos, they talk about humility and a sense of humor. You know, the Navy SEALs, I've said this on a number of broadcasts before, but you know, the Navy SEALs, their trident, their badge of belonging, the American eagle has its head bowed in humility, because you know, they know that, you know, if you get ahead of yourself, you know, you get shot. Same on a rugby field, same in a boardroom. You know, there's nothing wrong with being confident. And, you know, I think people mistake arrogance for confidence, but quiet confidence, the humility to know what you know and what you don't know, and to get better every day. That's real confidence. You know, that's the real basis for things, you know, and it creates the right climate. You know, there's nothing worse than somebody big noting themselves. There's nothing worse than somebody kind of inserting their ego into the conversation. Greg Popovich from the San Antonio Spurs has been on record saying that when he selects, he looks for people who have gotten over themselves. Kind of gotten beyond this. It's not about me. It's about we. Phil Jackson at the Chicago Bulls, you know, famously told Michael Jordan if he could exchange the me for the we, you know, he could have as many championship rings as he wanted. You know, Jordan left the Bulls with 6. Phil Jackson has 13 or something, or maybe more now. Yeah. You know, the selfless service is quite selfish. selfless service, if you can give credit away, you tend to do better. I think there's a quote, you can have everything you want as long as you're prepared to give other people the credit.
Yeah.
Sandhurst Military Academy, their mantra is serve to lead. Jim Collins in one of his books talks about level 5 leadership, which is, you're serving a cause, you're serving something bigger than yourself. And of course, spiritually, psychologically, that's an extraordinarily healthy place to stand anyway.
Yeah.
It's really, that's a form of kind of emotional transcendence. And so, I think there's something really in the human dynamic that as soon as we kind of it becomes about us and we become grasping and we want it all on our own terms, who wants doesn't get, I think it's, been said to kids over generations, and it's true in that, people read instinctively your intention as a leader. And so intentional leadership, purposeful leadership of making a contribution, being useful, leaving your mark, leaving the jersey in a better place, cultivating an environment in which others can thrive. I read an interesting piece. Don't quote me on it because I can't remember where I read it. That kids, 4-year-old kids can recognize leaders instinctively or very instinctively, and their criteria is, are they giving to the group?
Yeah.
Now that's true, I think, beyond, I think that's, anyone who has a family knows that's pretty true. That idea, if you're sitting there avoiding taking the bins out, getting weighted on hand and foot, I mean, that team isn't going to last very long.
No.
But if you're there kind of doing 100% and everyone else is doing 100%, you've got a crackingly energized, great climate and environment, and great things happen out of that. So that sense of contribution beyond yourself, I think, is incredibly important in life. The other thing about leadership, we're all leading a life, we're all leaders in our own life. So what can we learn from great leadership about making the decisions and being on the case in our own kind of personal practice, if you like?
Yeah. Go to our website, enterpriseexcellencepodcast.com/downloads to gain additional insights from the pre-interview discussions with James Kerr. There is also an article on how to be an effective coach, which is relevant to the show. Please like, subscribe, and share this podcast to help others gain insights and create a better future. Let's get back into the episode.
I think that was what's powerful in your book, and so true that you wrote in the book title, The Business of Life, because I took a lot from your book as much for life as it was for businesses and organizations. It was too true.
Yeah, well, that was quite intentional. My joke is it's like a self-help book you can read on the tube. You can read on blokes can read in public. And women too, but there's a little bit of that. I think one of the things that I learned very quickly being around in high-performing environments, that some of those things that lesser mortals, if that's the phrase, might feel shame about, since, well, working on myself is pretty uncool. Elite athletes, elite performers are unashamed about that. It's about getting better every day. They're voracious in self-improvement. And, self-improvement has a sort of a bad rep in some ways. It's kind of like supposed to be soft and new agey and and the worst examples of it, absolutely, I can understand that. But I think Alain de Botton said something like, every book is a self-help book.
Yeah.
At heart, we read to learn, to give us insight into what it is to be alive, to share our emotional journey with characters, with others. I wanted to try to universalize some of the messages from being just kind of, this is what you have to do if you want to be successful in business, to actually here are some underwriting, if you like, or underlying principles for what success in any domain might be, and what success is really, actually.
Yeah.
My definition of success is doing the stuff you love with people you love.
Yeah.
And to do that, you need to know yourself, and you need to have your values sorted. You need to know what that is, and you want to create an environment around yourself of genuine human connection. That's purposeful and is going in the right direction. And if you can do that in any space, I think certainly you're on the right track.
You're living a good life.
You're living a good life.
James, I've got a question I ask all guests, and it's like, what's been a recent insight for you? Like, what's something you've picked up on recently that's been like, wow, okay, that's interesting?
Well, you stumped me now. You didn't warn me this one was coming. I think I'll tell you an interesting story. The thing, I don't know if this is a sort of an insight, but I'm working on a book. I'm working on a couple of books at the moment. One is a follow-up to Legacy, with the workbook. Little plug there. The other one is a story of Gurkhas and Sherpas going up Everest. And then the 2015 Everest earthquake, and getting back on a country and its people getting back on its feet. And one of the things that struck me, so I spent a month in base camp or thereabouts.
Oh wow!
Didn't go any higher, but I'm not trained for that. But and it was an amazing time. And you're at altitude. At base camp, at Everest base camp, you're at 50% oxygen compared with sea level. So the breath becomes very important. Breathing becomes very important, because it's possible to, if you have oxygen debt, chances are the atmosphere doesn't have enough oxygen in it to pay you back. So you die. So you have to be very present. You have to be very present to you have to slow down. And what I realized, there are a lot of caves up at that kind of altitude, and Buddha lived in a cave for many years. The idea of the recluse, of the sort of the wise man, going up into the hills and going and living in a cave to discover the secret of life, is one of the great tropes of kind of religious literature, if you like, or of literature per se. One thing I realized, there's not much to do up there except be. And it comes down to the breath and atmosphere. The same root as Atman, which in the local in Hinduism is the spirit. So really, of course, the spirit of life is breathing, inspiration, bringing this and all of that. And so, one of the things we talked about climate before, in terms of from a leadership point of view, coming into that area about, who am I being in this moment? Am I being a leader? The being of a leader. And coming back to some of those fundamentals around, people talk about mindfulness and so on, but that sense of sort of presence, being present to the breath, being connected to the breath, self-regulation, breathing in the right way literally brings the heart rate down. And a lot of the time, if we want to regulate, rule, lead an environment, it begins with a degree of self-regulation. Who am I being in this situation? And I'm really interested in that, leading in the moment aspect of things. If we create that climate around ourselves, what kind of climate do we create in ourselves to enable that, the mood of the room? There's an educationalist who writes about, it's been misattributed to Goethe, but who writes about becoming an instrument of inspiration. And inspiration, of course, is breathing, is the breathing in the spirit, an instrument of inspiration. And so to be that, who do we have to, or to become that, who do we have to be, I think becomes a really interesting question. And it frames a lot of that kind of the self-regulation, self-control, self-management, self-leadership. And that leadership really begins within that I mentioned before, that the organization changes when the individual changes. Or an influential individual changes. So I'm really interested in that as an idea. And I'm not sure that answers your question, but maybe it comes back to kind of self-leadership. So somebody said there's the gap between a SEAL I interviewed, a former commander of the SEALs, talked about the gap between reaction and response, and there are a few famous quotes around that. That, you know, it's very easy to react. You know, we're sparked, we're triggered, something happens, we go off on our patterns, on our script.
Yeah.
Right. But actually, if we're able to create a gap between reaction and response, and kind of own our reaction and then give a more considered response, then that's a much more powerful way of being a leader. And so one of the things that leaders, good leaders, can work on and do work on is widening that gap, or at least holding that gap. And what does that take? Well, it takes resilience, it takes balance.
Yeah.
It takes work. You know, it takes presence.
Presence and being.
And it comes back to that, and you go, so who are you being when you're being a leader? I think becomes a really important question. And if you take some sort of sporting techniques, if you like, you know, there's a sort of technique of the wobbly chair or the not so wobbly chair. Are you sitting securely? You know, a chair has 4 legs. You know, it has a professional leg, kind of a technical capacity, you know, capability leg, has an emotional leg, you know, it has a physical leg, and it has a spiritual leg, let's say, or name your legs, whatever. Now, you know, a lot of the time we're busy and we throw everything onto one leg.
Yeah.
Right? Now, if that leg goes, what's going to hold you up? You know, you're balancing precariously on something that gives. You take that in a sporting thing. If your whole thing is about your performance, and you take a knock on the knee or you have a bad game, then you're going to come crumbling down. But if you've got strong emotional ties, connections, if your focus on your body, your breathing, your sleep, your fundamentals, your nutrition, you know, your exercise, and, you know, all of that. And if you have a sort of I'd sort of call it, say, a small s spiritual sense, it doesn't need to be God or church. Depends where you're at. It might be nature, it might be music. You know, it might be just the ability to realize that the existential realization that we're all just sort of bags of bones moving towards the same destination.
Yeah.
You know, get over yourself. Unless you have that strong foundation as a human being, you're not fit for purpose. You know, and if your purpose is to lead and to make a contribution and to leave the jersey in a better place, to write a legacy, to be a good ancestor, then are you fit for purpose? And so I'm really interested in taking the conversation into that dimension as well. Not only the climate you create around yourself, but the climate that you create within yourself as being a vital way of leading a life, of leading a team, and leading a business.
And it's so well connected, James, with what you're saying, because that shift started with Graham Henry. That shift starts with leadership, and you need to understand yourself and be aware of yourself first, and use that gap.
You know, I think so. I mean, if you think about, you know, psychologists, psychiatrists, you know, they're in therapy all the time, and it's not because they're not well. You know, it's because that's creating an optimum performance environment for what they do, to stay connected with themselves, to stay in the space of inquiry. And, you know, I think that's one of the things that's come out of sport and come through sort of, you know, mental health and psychology and all of that, is that psychology isn't necessarily a tool to fix you. Can be. But actually applied right, it's about getting the most out of life. It's about optimizing your performance environment. In sport, it's about optimization. It's about creating an optimum environment. And why wouldn't we choose some of those techniques, those processes, those learnings, those insights, to create, you know, the right environment within ourselves, so that we create the right impact beyond ourselves. One of the phrases I use is, the story you tell yourself turns out to be the story that others tell about you. You know, we define our story.
Yeah.
And you want it to be a healthy, rich, you know, connected, balanced, beautiful story. And if you're able to create that around yourself and within yourself by doing the work, leading from within, the ripples go outwards from that.
Yeah.
The impact that you will have will be qualitatively different and better than if you're kind of a messed up bundle of anxiety making snap decisions because you're highly pressurized and unable to cope. So take care of yourself to take care of your people. The cliche, when the oxygen mask comes down, when your plane's about to hit the ocean, you put it on yourself first before you put it on other people. It's a cliche, but it's very, very true.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in that, what's our own personal leadership environment and how are we able to take the leadership conversation into that kind of space, as well as the more functional, practical, people-oriented side of it.
I think you're onto something there, James, to really help many, many more organizations. Like as leaders, as we optimize ourselves, we'll optimize our organization. That's powerful. Yeah. James, thank you so much for sharing knowledge, and thank you so much for the books you've written and the books you are writing. I'll be one of your first readers as soon as I see them come out. James, how can people reach out to you? How can they connect and gain more knowledge or link in for help if they need?
Yeah, well, LinkedIn is good. I'm on LinkedIn. Google is useful. kerrjames1@me.com is my email. That'll come straight to me. I think I've got various web presence kind of in the back of books and things like that. The book is called Legacy: 15 Lessons in Leadership, what the All Blacks can teach us about the business of life. So there's that. And there are various, I'm a fan of podcasts. So there are a number of interviews and podcasts that I've done. I think this form is a really lovely way of discussing the nuances, I think, of the work that I do, and hopefully connecting with different communities in a way. As I said, it's how can we improve the world of work? How can we create better environments for ourselves and for the people that we lead or the people that we stand beside in that? And and I think one of the joys of podcasts is that it kind of reaches out into all of these different communities. So Google is your friend, I would say, and to answer that question.
Well, James, thank you so much. And thank you for your knowledge and time. And thank you for writing such a great book that I took so much from. And
it's a real pleasure. Thanks, Brad. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for anyone who's been listening.
Cheers, James. Talk soon.
Cheers.
The two key takeaways for me from this episode were: leaders create leaders, pass the ball, and secondly, sweep the sheds, humble leadership. The first key takeaway is from the leaders create leaders statement James made. Right the way down to the front line in an organisation, this is a leader's role. In James's book Legacy, he writes about the All Blacks pass the ball lesson. The job of a leader, right down to the front line employee, is to create leaders, people who are empowered, focused on their goal, motivated, and leading the way forward. The second key takeaway, sweep the sheds, is about humility and leadership. One of the All Blacks' lessons in leadership is that senior players and leaders sweep down the change room at the end of a game. They do not leave it to the cleaners or get the players to do it. They do it themselves. This behaviour demonstrates and creates a culture of humility, unity, and respect. It is incredible how one simple leadership behaviour can create so many positive outcomes. These are called capstone behaviours that have a positive flow-on effect to many other benefits. A great approach as a leader is to think about the culture you are looking to build or improve. Think about the behaviour you and your team could focus on that you predict would have many other positive cultural flow-on effects.